Okay, well, welcome to everyone. I'm Jeffrey Burns. I'm the director of the Harps Center for Catholic Thought and Culture here at the University of San Diego. And I'm very pleased to be with you and to share this with the Changemaker Hub and other supporters. We are in the ministry center, so we have a hybrid audience. So several of our members are live and the rest of you are on Zoom, but welcome to everybody who's here, both live and on Zoom. This is part of a series that we've been running on humanity's urgent challenges, which is an offshoot of the vision statement of the University of San Diego, where it says that we're a contemporary, engaged Catholic university confronting humanity's urgent challenges. And so we're working now with the Changemaker Hub's Urgent Challenges Collective. So we're very pleased to be part of the series. 3 prior meetings that we had issues on race, on peace and nonviolence, and on climate crisis. So you're welcome to view those on our YouTube channel, as you will this one as well. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Dr. Kate DeConnick. Kate, it's yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And thank you to everyone for being here for today's event. My name is Kate DeConnick. I teach in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. And along with Dr. Mike Williams, I am also the co-director of the Urgent Challenges Collective. So if you haven't heard of the collective before, we are an initiative on campus that supports research, teaching, and advocacy work on the issue of homelessness here in San Diego. This event today is actually part of our 3rd annual Homelessness Action Week here at USD, which provides opportunities for students, faculty, and staff, and community members to learn more about homelessness and to get involved in helping to address this issue. So given that USD strives to be an engaged contemporary Catholic university that equips students to be change makers in our community, we wanted to host an event that would allow us to further discuss the work that's being done by Catholics and Christians to address homelessness both locally and across the nation and world. So some of the questions that will guide today's sessions is thinking about what impact is the church having in meeting the immediate needs of those who are unhoused? How are Christians contributing to larger scale societal change? And what are some of the promising models that we might consider for moving forward? So we're probably not going to answer all of those questions in full or do them full justice in our hour together, but we're going to do our best in our conversation. I'm going to turn the Zoom mic over in just a second to Dr. Mike Williams, who's going to introduce today's speakers. Before we do that, I just wanted to share a couple of Zoom etiquette or navigation tips with all of you, because we're going to have a pretty big audience today. We'll have some people coming and going from our Zoom room too, for meetings or things like that, which is totally fine. But since we'll have a pretty big group, we're going to ask you to please keep your audio muted in order to minimize any background noise. We've all been in Zoom rooms that have had that before, so we're going to avoid that. And additionally, after our speakers finish their presentations, we're going to have time for questions and answers. And we decided that the easiest way to moderate the question and answer session for today's event is to use a shared Google Doc. So I had mentioned this in the email that I sent out to everybody who registered for today's event, but I'll put the link in the chat in just a second as well. The way it works is you can open up your chat window in Zoom, or if you're in our live audience, you can open it up on your through your email that I sent out to you. And just open the Google Doc link that I'm about to send to you in just a moment here, and just type any questions for our speakers or for our moderator directly into the Google Doc. And that's how we'll choose questions and kind of moderate the discussion at the end. Okay. So Dr. Williams, I'm going to turn things over to you to introduce our wonderful speakers for today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. DeConnick. We are thrilled to be here. And as Kate mentioned, I teach in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and I work with her on our homelessness initiative. And my big job today is to introduce our amazing panel. So I'm going to get to that so we can hear from them right now. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to be presenting today. So first, it is a pleasure to introduce Deacon Jim Vargas. Deacon Vargas is the president and CEO of Father Joe's Villages, where he's been since 2015. But his title and the work he has done at Father Joe's is only part of his story. Deacon Vargas has also been an incredible advocate for those experiencing homelessness, and he has been active in the broader public policy conversations about how to solve this issue. And as I'm sure all of you may be aware, this summer, Father Joe Carroll, the founder of Father Joe's Villages, passed away at age 80. And while we miss his inspiring leadership, we are so grateful for his enduring legacy that continues on under Deacon Vargas's leadership. And we're just thrilled to have him here today. And next we have, thrilled to have Dr. Laura Stivers with us. She is a professor at the Dominican University of California, where she teaches courses and conducts research on social and environmental justice. Of her many important works that she's done, her book, Disrupting Homelessness, Alternative Christian Approaches from 2011 is an incredible analysis, and it's one that we've used in our classes on homelessness here at USD. And as we were telling her before we got on Zoom, our students love the book. So it's getting a very good read here. And last but certainly not least, we are so happy to welcome Dr. Odilka Santiago as our discussant and moderator. Dr. Santiago is an assistant professor of sociology here at USD. She earned her PhD in sociology from SUNY Binghamton University. She has conducted extensive research in New York City on homelessness, and she has worked with the grassroots organization Picture the Homeless on housing and civil rights for unhoused people. We feel so lucky that she's now here in California with us here at USD. Okay, so now we're ready to hear from our amazing panelists, and Deacon Vargas, the Zoom space is yours. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Williams, thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with the other panelists who will be speaking, with Dr. Laura, as well as Dr. Santiago, who will be emceeing. It's really a pleasure. You know, it won't surprise you, since I'm a deacon, that I'm going to start by making reference to scripture. And I say that because really what we do as church, and since this is a panel discussion on homelessness and church, right? And what it means to be church is based and rooted on scripture, right? So we know that we hear St. James, the Apostle St. James, who says that faith without works is dead, is lifeless, right? And we know that what drives us is to live the gospel values. By extension, when we look at the Hebrew scriptures themselves, and I'll tell you why I'm extending it to the Hebrew scriptures in a moment. When we look at the Hebrew scriptures, we find that God, the essence of God, is mercy and compassion. That is the very essence of God, right? Not that God is merciful, but that God is mercy, right? Not that he is compassionate, but that he is compassion, right? And so so when we think about the Hebrew scriptures and we think about our Jewish brothers in the faith, right? They are driven, as we are, by the face of God, right? By the fact that each and every single one of us has the dignity of being made in God's image. And I draw in the Hebrew scriptures because one of here at Father Joe's Villages, one of our longest relationships and partnerships, which I cherish tremendously, is with Congregation Beth Israel in La Jolla. They've been serving the poor, who we're blessed to serve here at Father Joe's Villages, for 35 years with us. 35 years. Every Sunday morning, they have served breakfast without exception every Sunday morning. And in fact, I'm going to be at Shabbat this Friday in La Jolla, presenting them with a plaque because they've just reached a very significant milestone. Not only have they served meals, they also give us a monthly stipend as well. And it's now past the $1 million mark. So, and they have also passed, they are also at they have served 1,500,000 meals during that period of time. So it's quite a milestone that I want to celebrate with them. And so I'll be doing that at Shabbat. And I say that because while we're focusing on church and we're focusing in a sense on Christianity, the reality is that when it comes to mercy and compassion that we should have for one another, that really, I think we as human beings all respond to that because we're all made in the image of God. And that's what God is all about. So Father Joe's Villages, in the equation, in this space of homelessness, we are now entering our 72nd year. Right? We are the oldest homeless services provider in Southern California. We're also the biggest, right? On any given night, we provide some level of housing to almost 3,000 individuals on any given night. Right. And that includes anywhere from a shelter bed all the way up to affordable housing and permanent supportive housing. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So, the church very much is in the space of homelessness. It was back in 1950 that the then Bishop Buddy, which had a hand in establishing USD, in fact, right? Back then, you'll remember Bishop Buddy and the foundations of USD, saw the need of the poor and the suffering, right? And the fact that the poor have the dignity of being made in God's image, and said, we church need to do something about this, right? And so that's when he established what wasn't called Father Joe's Villages back then. It was Mary by the Wayside, actually, and it was very humble beginnings. It was basically just providing some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, right? Then when you fast forward, and I will fast forward very quickly to the 1980s, right, 30 years into the endeavor, is when Father Joe Carroll, and Dr. Williams referred to Father Joe Carroll, who just recently passed. He came onto the scene because the then Bishop Maher asked him to make this his ministry, and he built it into what it is. And what Father Joe noticed is that the services were scattered all over the place, right? And it was, well, one agency provided healthcare, and another one provided housing, and another one provided shelter, and another one provided help with the kids, and so forth. And he realized that that wasn't working, because those who were mired and plagued with homelessness couldn't access all those services for various reasons. And so that was the genesis of what is now Father Joe's Villages, when he built a village in downtown San Diego, in order to basically bring in all those services under one roof, a one-stop shop in a sense, right? And then truly be able to make a difference in the lives of individuals. And it was incredible, because at the point where he did that, that's when we saw movement in the homeless population, getting people off the streets, right? On a permanent basis, actually, right? And we continue that legacy. So models, when you talk about models that to address homelessness, I mean, we like to think of Father Joe's Villages, that we really have a really sound model. And we say that because of all of our years of experience and the successes that we've had. And we've been big enough where we've been able to repurpose programs and dollars in order to more effectively serve those who are on the streets, and be efficient and be good stewards of those funds, whether they be public funds or whether they be private funds and philanthropy. So right now, we have a $45 million budget. So it's quite a large budget, and yet is nowhere near enough, obviously, in order to really address homelessness as a whole. But through that, we have a federally qualified health center. And that health center not only addresses physical issues, but also address behavioral health issues. And about 50% of those who are on the streets, who are suffering from homelessness, especially if they've been chronically homeless, have some level of behavioral health issues, be it mental health, be it substance use disorder, and sometimes both. A lot of times it's both. A lot of times what we find is that individuals who self-medicate basically because of their condition, and in time that self-medication leads to mental health issues, and then sometimes it's the other way around, right? Sometimes there are behavioral health issues, and they devolve, not evolve, but it devolve in a sense into also taking substances, right? So that's a big issue. There's also a dental clinic, and you may wonder, well, why is that so important? Well, we have a wall of smiles actually at Father Joe's Villages, and when I give tours, I love stopping before that wall of smiles, and you see the before and after restorative dentistry. You see where people barely have teeth, and then where they have a full mouth of teeth, right? And not only does that help with self-esteem, again, the dignity aspect, right? But also it helps obviously with digestion, because digestion starts in the mouth, right? But then also very practically, I always point to the wall of smiles and I say, who's going to get the job? Is it this person or this person, the one without the teeth or the one with the teeth? I mean, there are biases out there, obviously, and the tendency will be to hire someone who has a full set of teeth, right? Who looks good, which is why we make sure that through our Dress for Success closet, or room, I should say, that they have what they need in order to go for interviews, basically, all right? And so anything that we do is very intentionally done in order to be able to help them off the streets and stay off the streets. So that's the federally qualified health center. We also have a therapeutic childcare center that works with the children. Anywhere from infancy, just last week, We had a woman who was at our shelter, was pregnant, had been with us for a bit, came time to give birth. She went off to the hospital for 2 days, gave birth, and now she's back with the baby, right? So the baby's first home is our shelter. And we're happy to be able to have that place for her. Otherwise, she'd be on the streets, right? So, and the Therapeutic Child Care Center works with children anywhere from infancy all the way up to 18 years of age. And we also support transitional age youth, those who are between the ages of 18 and 24, 25 years of age, who have been typically in the foster care system, age out, and then lose all resources. And 50% of them within 3 years are in one of 3 places or situations. They're either on the streets, homeless, they're incarcerated, or they're dead, right? It's quite a startling statistic, and that's a nationwide statistic. And so that we're blessed to be able to work with that population as well. This Therapeutic Child Care Center has social workers, has teachers, right? Has the resources that are needed in order to address the academic, emotional, and social needs of these kids who are in homeless situations. We know that unless we mitigate their circumstances, these children are 4.5 times more apt to be homeless in adulthood, right? Statistically, right? So it's important that we help them break that cycle of homelessness and help them to be at their peer level so they can compete appropriately and not be frustrated and be the future dropouts and the future individuals on the streets. It also helps the parents, this center, because the parents are able to feel comfortable in having their children cared for, and then they can focus on their health situations, they can focus on their employment situations, on their housing situations. Also, we help them build familial bonds. A lot of them, frankly, don't know how to parent well, right? They've never had good role models as parents. And then so it translates down over the generations. And so they don't know how to parent well. So we work with them on being able to parent their children. So it's a great resource that we have within our village as a whole. I mentioned employment before, that Dress for Success. That's within our employment center. Even people who are housed, the way to self-sufficiency is through having marketable skills, so that then you can gain employment and you can have income, and that leads to self-sufficiency, right? It's for all of us on this call, that's the case, right? And obviously it's the same for those who are on the streets. So that our vocational training center works with them through programs like culinary arts or welding, facilities management, property management, hospitality. And we have certificate-bearing programs where they attend these programs, they're recognized by the businesses in the market, and then we're able to help them gain employment so that then they can have the self-sufficiency and feel good about themselves and taking care of their own families. So that's an important aspect. And it also works with them in preparing resumes and networking and computer skills. It gives them the tools. Again, everything we do is intentional. It gives individuals the tool to be able to help them leave their situation of homelessness. And then, of course, we have the shelter beds. That we have more shelter beds than any other provider actually in this area. We have over 1,000 shelter beds in various locations. Our biggest shelter is at Golden Hall. It's in the Civic Center area right next to, ironically, right next to City Hall. I think it's a great place so that our politicians can be reminded constantly that this is an issue that's front and center, and it's a priority and needs to be addressed. And there we have 526 beds for single men, family members on another floor, and the transitional age youth that I referenced before. And so that's just one of our many centers. And then we have affordable housing. Father Joe was the first one building affordable housing for our population back 25 years ago. And about a year after I arrived, actually, we embarked on an initiative that we called the Turning the Key Initiative. And through that initiative, we committed to the community that we would build 2,000 affordable housing units, right? Yes, it's important to get people off the streets in the immediacy. That's extremely important. And that's where the shelter system comes in, and our shelter beds. We start working with them. They're in sanitary conditions and safe conditions. So we start working with them. But that said, a shelter is not a home. A home is when they have a key to an apartment. right? So we decided 5 years ago, we embarked that we would, an aggressive goal, quite an audacious goal actually, of 2,000 units. And if you and it's very hard to build housing in this town, unfortunately, but you fast forward, and we're just a couple of months away, actually, or early February, in cutting a ribbon on a 14-story, 407-unit building. And it will take over 500 people off the streets. I'm as excited as could be about it because it's a change maker for this town. It's the largest endeavor of its kind ever in the county of San Diego for our population. And we're pleased to be in the forefront of it, right? And it really is exciting. So that's 407 beds. We also last year, as part of turning the key, we also looked for motels with an eye towards acquiring them and refurbishing them. So last year we did just that in the South Bay area, and we purchased a motel. Within 7 months, we had converted it into 83 spanking new units, each self-contained, right? Studios, each of them very dignified. And there's permanent supportive housing. So every individual who lives in these units has some level of disability. It could be physical, it could be mental, it could be substance use disorder issues, and we serve them. The key towards success in providing housing for our population are the comprehensive and wraparound services that are constantly at their disposal. The ones that I mentioned before. It's not a matter of just putting an individual within 4 walls. We know that doesn't work. It's really the case management and the ongoing services that helps them retain that housing. In fact, 95% of those who we've helped into permanent housing retain that housing long-term, right? And the wraparound services is what makes the difference there. Right? So these are just, if you think about it, think about all the programs that I just described. Right? And you think about what really plagues those who are on the streets. We're able truly to help individuals off the street and towards self-sufficiency. And that's what it's all about, right? Now, when it comes to behavioral health, it's not a very easy thing to do. I mean, people who have been chronically homeless, one of the things you have to do is build relationship and rapport so that over time, you get them to trust you, to come in for those types of services. That's a constant challenge for us. We instituted the first street health program here in San Diego just the year prior to the pandemic in 2019. And this year, and by the way, our clinicians go out literally treating people on the sidewalk, right? Whether it's the wounds that have to be bound, or whether it's dispensing medication because of their high blood pressure or because of their high blood sugar, whatever, taking the medicine out to them, because we know that a good portion of the population would not access healthcare in a traditional way in brick and mortar, right? So we've gone out there, and that's been a tremendous success. I mean, I was particularly excited about doing this because I was convinced, and I still am, that we would impact the number of individuals who would be dying on the streets, right? That we would positively impact that, right? So that we could catch individuals on the streets before that was to happen. And if nothing more, that they would be helped in the indoors, so that if they were to expire, at least they had the dignity of being cared for. And so this year, we are now in the process of expanding that street health program and including psychiatric care. So we're sending psychiatric clinicians out there onto the streets. Again, because of what I mentioned before, how difficult it is when someone is mired in behavioral health issues, and being able to work with them and try to convince them that there's a better way, there's a better life, right? So there's so much more that I could say, but I want to stop there because I want to be respectful. I'm probably over my time at this point. I hope not, but I can go on and on about this. I really do appreciate the full focus that you're giving to this. It is really, it's such an important issue. And I don't say it just because I'm leading Father Joe's Villages, but it's such an important issue for the community of San Diego, and actually for the United States as a whole. I mean, we have 550,000 individuals who are homeless in the United States, right? San Diego has the 5th largest homeless population, with just a little over 7,600 individuals who are homeless, half of whom are on the streets, right, and are unsheltered. So it very much is an important situation. I'm going to read just something very quickly that I read just prior to starting the Zoom that I shared with the panelists, my fellow panelists here. It was an article actually this Sunday in the newspaper, and it was written by Gary Worth. And what he relayed was the story of one individual who was seriously impacted by mental health issues, seriously impacted. And the system failed him. I mean, our system is broken here in San Diego as far as really being able to care for those who are mired in mental health. And this is an individual who had parents who were caring and were trying to get this person help for years, over the years and years and years. And finally, the system had failed him to such an extent that he wound up dying. Right? And the reason I pointed out is first of all, it was a great article that was written. It really showed you the humanity of this person and the humanity of the parents. But the closing quote is what really got me, and emotionally actually got me, because the parent, there's a quote from the mother at the very end, who had tried for so many years from her son's childhood to try to get him the assistance that he needed. And again, the system was just not there to be able to adequately do it. And the closing quote says this: when he was a little boy, he'd cry and say, "Why can't I be like other kids?" I'd say, "Joey, you're different, but not in a bad way. You dance to a different drum. You were put on this earth for a reason, and we don't know what that reason is right now." Right? I gotta tell you, as a parent, just reading that and knowing that the suffering on the part of this mother for her child, she had lost her child. She had lost, now he was into adulthood. But for years and years, he has struggled with mental health. And like I said, there's something that needs to be done. And so I didn't want to end on a downer in a sense, but that was, that'll stay with me for a long time. Well, with that, let me turn it over. Thank you.
Should I go ahead? Okay, well, thanks you everyone for inviting me. And thank you to Deacon Jim for telling us about Father Joe's Villages. It's so nice to have conversation with people in other parts of the state, since both San Diego and the Bay Area where I live are both struggling with the problems of homelessness and lack of affordable housing. So I thought, let's start by looking at the minimum wage in San Diego. It's $14 an hour. That would be about $2,275 a month. That's assuming one's working full 40 hours a week and isn't out sick at any time. Whereas the average rent in San Diego is $2,075 a month. So just do the math, and we know that San Diego has a housing crisis. Furthermore, the pandemic eviction moratorium just expired at the end of September. And landlords are increasingly requiring renters to have a household income that's 3 times the cost of rent to ensure payment. So this gap between wages and housing costs in San Diego shows us that homelessness is not simply an issue for the chronically unhoused population on the streets. The crisis of people without a home, living in overcrowded or substandard housing, or even in their cars or RVs. That's true in my neighborhood. Down about 5 minutes from my house, there's a whole long line of RVs, is affecting many people, including families with children, as Deacon Jim mentioned, and the elderly. Half of the homeless population in the US is actually over 50, and that's up from 11% in 1990. So that's increased drastically. Well, spending no more than 30% of income is considered affordable. Over 40% of households spend more than that on housing costs in San Diego. And San Diego is now currently the 3rd highest living cost burden among metropolitan areas in the nation. San Francisco is probably right up above it. 81% of low-income families are paying more than half of their income on housing costs in San Diego. And I just saw an article a couple of weeks ago that said Black renters are more rent burdened in San Diego than anywhere else in the nation. So a racial analysis of homelessness and housing is important. The Department of Housing and Urban Development identifies 3 housing problems. One is substandard housing. That can be anything from incomplete plumbing or minimal kitchen facilities. 2 is overcrowding. And 3 is what I just talked about, heavy cost burden. And clearly, some racial groups are more likely to experience one or more of these housing problems. So 2/3 of Black and Pacific Islander households, half of Hispanic households, compared to 1/3 of Asian households and 40% of white non-Hispanic households. Historic policies that segregated neighborhoods by race and kept communities of color out of home ownership continue to have a lasting impact on household wealth and stability. In 2019, white households had 8 times more wealth than Black households and 5 times more than Hispanic households. Housing is not the only factor, but that's a huge factor in what led people to gain wealth. Today, we have zoning laws and policies with less obvious and overt racial prejudice, but that continue to keep neighborhoods segregated. And increasingly, gentrification in metropolitan areas like San Diego is displacing many people of color. That's happening pretty rapidly here in the Bay Area and San Francisco and Oakland as well. While churches and individual Christians should definitely support homeless service organizations like Father Joe's Village, especially since they're doing the wraparound services, portable housing, shelters, and so on, because we want to serve those who are unhoused, especially the chronically homeless, and we want to keep those who have lost their housing from ending up on the streets. But Christians also need to be involved in preventing homelessness by addressing the root causes of it. It's time to ask ourselves why homelessness and precarious housing is the norm for so many in our society. It's far too easy to blame or try to fix the victims of societal oppression and injustice instead of envisioning what structures and policies need to be changed. Societal response is often to criminalize those who are deemed undeserving, such as ticketing and jailing the chronically homeless, especially those with addictions and/or severe mental illness. San Diego police issued more than twice as many tickets for quote unquote illegal lodging during the first year of the pandemic than they had the year before, despite the former mayor's public message that the homeless population would be housed in the convention center. Now, of course, individual factors can play a role in someone's homelessness, but I always share the musical chairs analogy with my students. It's borrowed from someone else. The players are poor households, and the chairs are the housing units people can afford. Right now in our nation, there are 37 affordable units available for every 100 extremely poor households nationwide. So there's clearly not enough chairs. And those who fail to nab a chair are those who are most vulnerable, whether by reason of individual choices or social and or racial oppression and exclusion. The level of scarcity, too few chairs or too few housing units, is a result of housing supply, prices, and subsidies, as well as incomes at the bottom of the distribution and low social welfare spending in our nation. Now, most Christian congregations embrace the value of hospitality rather than criminalization and tend to take either a charity approach, that is, provide food, shelter, or other resources, or an empowerment approach by offering education, addiction programs, counseling for trauma, parenting classes, whatever it is. Too few Christian congregations, however, focus on the root causes and the way things are structured within society to make housing security so precarious for so many. Charity and empowerment approaches are easier, and they allow for volunteer experiences that make people feel they're making an immediate difference in people's lives. Not to say they are easy, but an advocacy or community organizing approach that addresses root causes and structural factors is a much longer term endeavor that requires coalitions of groups organizing together and a real presence and involvement within marginalized communities, not just short-term volunteer experiences. Done well, it entails the involvement of low-income and racially diverse groups in creating change and participating in the decisions that affect their families, their lives, their families, their lives, and communities. Middle-class and affluent, often white churches can work in solidarity for change, but the parishioners must have some awareness of their power and privilege and the propensity to see themselves as the experts rather than working in mutuality and cross-racial and class movements for justice. Solidarity requires sustained involvement and commitment to the process of organizing with others. Now, Catholics have long been involved in addressing socioeconomic issues through congregation-based community organizing within low-income communities. And there's a rich moral heritage within Catholic social teachings that emphasizes economic justice and the flourishing of communities. The Catholic Church has also had inspiring leaders for economic justice over the years, like John Ryan, who supported and organized for wealth distribution, unions, and living wages. Dorothy Day, who developed houses of hospitalities for unhoused people. And Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, who organized with the California farm workers for better working conditions and wages, just to name a few. As far back as 1891, Pope Leo VIII advocated for a living wage in his encyclical Rerum Novarum. Pope Francis, in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, connects care for the earth to the rights of all people, especially the poor, to have access to the earth's goods and to not be oppressed by powerful interests and a consumerist culture that encourages some to take more than their fair share. And the US Catholic bishops have a national anti-poverty program called the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. In their 1996 Catholic Framework for Economic Life, they claim all have a right to the basic necessities of life and to productive work with just wages, benefits, and decent working conditions. Furthermore, they argue that society has a moral obligation, including governmental action where necessary, to assure opportunity, meet basic human needs, and pursue justice in economic life. So clearly there's a Catholic foundation for an advocacy approach that addresses structural injustice. The problem of homelessness and precarious housing can be addressed from many different angles, since the foundation of the problem is poverty, inequality, and continued structural oppression and marginalization of particular groups of people, especially structural racism, but also other forms as well. Addressing any number of structural inequities, whether it's in education, healthcare, work, housing, the environment, can positively contribute to housing security for low-income households. It doesn't just need to be housing policy. Congregations can be involved in small-scale efforts to provide housing, like Father Joe's Villages, despite it being a pretty big scale in San Diego, of doing affordable housing and refurbished hotels. Another example is San Diego's YIGBY. This stands for Yes in God's Backyard, as opposed to NIMBY, Not in My Backyard. A group focused on addressing the housing crisis by engaging congregations and developing multifamily projects on underutilized faith community properties. I've actually read about their effort. I don't know the group, but their goal is to build 3,000 units by 2025, and I liked their name. Many congregations have also been involved with Habitat for Humanity, who offers homeownership for low-income households. Such efforts are really important, but they're only a drop in the bucket compared to the need. Thus, I agree with the Catholic bishops that governmental action is imperative. Private provision of affordable housing, whether through nonprofits or real estate developers, is not meeting the housing need. So getting involved in advocacy efforts to support or change public policy and or hold government accountable for regulation and investment for a common good, with particular attention to low-income communities of color, is important to creating inclusive and just communities where everyone is housed and feels at home. One way to do this is to join a local affiliate of a CBCO, that's a congregation-based community organizing network. These are interfaith coalitions of churches, synagogues, and mosques with members across race and class lines that engage in local grassroots organizing to improve the well-being of marginalized communities. The two national groups with local San Diego affiliates are Gamamil and People Improving Communities Through Organizing, otherwise known as PICO. PICO California has been instrumental in the effort to raise the minimum wage in local cities and counties in California. And recently, they've been organizing to stop gentrification and for policy changes that create more affordable housing. Another way to make a difference is to partner with well-respected nonprofit organizations in low-income communities. I'm not familiar as much with San Diego, but in the Bay Area where I live, a group of African-American churches in Oakland joined forces with the Dellums Institute for Social Justice to organize against gentrification and the displacement of families of color in Berkeley and Oakland, specifically addressing the racialization of the problem of homelessness. They directed $65 million of public funds toward an anti-displacement safety net that would help pay for legal protection for renters, emergency rental assistance, and other services for residents at risk of displacement or homelessness. They also secured anti-displacement terms in the city of Oakland's $100 million housing bond and removed housing barriers for formerly incarcerated residents, which has definitely affected the communities of color. They also assisted the East Oakland Black Culture Zone Collaborative in developing a collective ownership model business plan for the Black Culture Zone Hub. All of these strategies aided in preventing homelessness and displacement, and although these policies help low-income people of all races, their work was strategically focused on preventing eviction and homelessness for residents in communities of color. So solving homelessness in our nation will not be a simple fix of having more shelters, job training, or addiction programs, nor will occasional volunteering to help the unhoused suffice. I always hold out hope that we can work together to be part of a social movement to create a more compassionate, inclusive, and just society where all have access to God's banquet table, to adequate housing, food, healthcare, green space, safety, and more, where we can live near one another and share in fellowship across race and class lines, as well as bridge other ways we're divided, and where all are able to meaningfully participate and contribute in society. Simply being good Samaritans to those who cross our paths is not justice work. As Martin Luther King once said, we must see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. In other words, justice requires more than charity or empowerment approaches. In King's word again, quote, the edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring, unquote. While there's substantial work to be done, especially in our current climate of inequality, racial injustice, and political division, an advocacy approach that works to change inequitable structures can create its own hopeful momentum. I will conclude by citing the first two principles in the U.S. Catholic Bishops' framework for economic life. First, the economy exists for the person, not the person for the economy. And second, all economic life should be shaped by moral principles. Economic choices and institutions must be judged by how they protect or undermine the life and dignity of the human person, support the family, and serve the common good, unquote. May we all be called to be involved in the process of creating communities where everyone has a home and feels welcomed and supported. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We don't have much time, so I'm going to just jump right in. Just an observation. What I really appreciate was within both presentations, the perspective that the church has in mind historically and today, the imperative to address structural inequality and at two different fronts, whereas Dr. Stivers, is that how you pronounce your name? Thanks, sorry. Would say that it's always been a coalitional movement historically that addresses racism, structural inequality, poverty. Through campaigns, through coalitional building, it's always been about this. I also look to Deacon Vargas or Deacon Jim, who also says that working with different religious groups, like the Judaic group in La Jolla, has also been a part of providing that service, and it's foundational. And I want to just say that given my experience with homeless in New York, it's always been imperative to look at the space of the church as a safe space generally, even if you're not adopting the denomination. A lot of people who live on the streets, in my experience, have a distrust for those working in institutions, whether it's the criminal justice system, social services, and even shelters, because of the experience of humiliation and trauma and sometimes abuse. And so this is a great opportunity to talk about where we can go beyond that space that is generally seen as only having religion and morality in mind and doing the practice of advocacy. whether it's through everyday providing services like Smile is super important for opportunity, for dignity, right? And also long-term coalitional buildings with other organizations around structural poverty and gentrification and so on. So I want to go straight into the questions because we don't have much time. And so just looking at the chat, the first question that seems really important for students is, what advice would you give to students at USD and other Catholics who are interested in supporting those who are unhoused? What are the best ways for us to take action on these issues? And this is a question that is for both our panelists.
Go ahead, Deacon Jim, because you're in San Diego and you might be familiar with more of the avenues in San Diego.
Oh, sure. I mean, first and foremost is just to recognize their humanity and a smile, as you just mentioned, Dr. Santiago, just acknowledging them, right? A lot of times they're stigmatized because of their homelessness, right? And people, for whatever reason, I mean, it's not that individuals, people don't want to help necessarily or be friendly, but they find it awkward, right? And they walk by without making eye contact and like, so something as simple as just acknowledging their existence, I think it goes a long way. Do partner with services providers who are able to help individuals off the streets. And because with those service providers, you have one leg up in a sense, you as an individual who wants to volunteer, who wants to make a difference, right? You're working, that's being done for you. They're being taken off the streets. And here now you can partner with the service provider to be able to help, either to provide some meals. I had someone who just, in the chat actually, just a few minutes ago, mentioned to me that she had volunteered at the health center years and years ago, and that has inspired her to go into dentistry. And she's now finishing up dental school. And she's excited about the prospect of possibly coming back and some level of service as a dentist at Father Joe's Villages, right? Isn't that great, right? So there are many ways in which you can help at Father Joe's Villages. It isn't just handing out meals, right? It's through the therapeutic childcare center. It's through and working with the children there. It's through the health center. It's through the shelter programs that we have as well, right? So there are many ways. So I would say, again, and when you meet people on the street, you can always ask whether you can help them by way of putting them in touch with services providers. I get a lot of calls from people actually who day in and day out, they see someone on the street and they call me and they say there's someone on such and such a corner, all right? And they give me the name as an example. And sometimes if there's a cell phone, that's even more helpful because then we can reach out. We have outreach teams that go out to various communities and we try to connect with them. Right. And again, maybe it's not the first time, the second time, maybe it isn't until the 10th contact that you convince a person to accept some help. But we're able to start working with them. So anyway, I hope that answers the question to some extent.
I would just add that follow your passion because you can address homelessness and housing from all different areas. Like I said, if you're in healthcare, if you are an environmentalist, all of these a labor union organizer, whatever you're interested in, the root causes really are poverty and inequality, environmental destruction. All of this contributes to housing and precarious housing and homelessness. But whatever avenue you take, I would agree with Deacon Jim that you need to be within the community and you need to be listening to those who are on the ground and being affected by these issues because they have the most insight, and we all have blind spots when we have privilege or power, and so that's why a lot of my courses are service learning courses where students are really working long-term over different semesters within the community and learning for themselves what they can do, direct charity or empowerment approaches, but also what they can do to start organizing to change structures and policies.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, going back to how campaign policies are a part of the mission of the church. It's not that it's separate and there's a separation of church and state, but we're very much involved in that discussion on how we impact and come together to impact policy change, and also asking those who are affected, not assuming we know, right? So going on that, there's been discussions on Not in My Backyard, known as NIMBY, and then Yes in My Backyard, but also you've mentioned this, Dr. Stivers, of Yes in God's Backyard, and the collaborations and discussions around taking underutilized church properties and redirecting them for affordable housing units. And also, Deacon Vargas, you talked about, providing permanent housing for those who need it, right? And this is a big discussion as we know that the rent is too damn high, as I quote this politician in the Bronx, excuse my language. But there's something to be said about what is the role of the church in providing a space that actually can get involved with the effects of rezoning laws and gentrification and increasing price of rents from private developers. What are your opinions?
Right. I think, in fact, the Homelessness Awareness Week is coming up in the week of the 15th, actually. And we at Father Joe's Villages plan to have an entire week of different activities, each day devoted to a different activity. For instance, on day one, we're going to be sending out kits that educate and raise the awareness level for those who are interested, obviously, as far as homelessness is concerned here, specifically in San Diego. Then there's another day that's going to be for advocacy, and this gets to your point, right? And how people can advocate with the politicians, local politicians, state politicians, as an example, and so that their voice can be heard as far as policy is concerned. We very much, we Father Joe's Villages very much see that as our role, especially because we're a leader in the space of homelessness, right? So I'm constantly meeting with the politicians locally and statewide to try to impact those changes to policy. When we mentioned behavioral health, we're very much into conversations as it relates to behavioral health because that's such a key issue. And we see it time and time again when we see people who are suffering on the streets and can't help themselves. There's also another day that will in the Homeless Awareness Week that will focus on volunteer activities, right? And how you can get involved in different activities in that way. So in any case, just in the next week or so, you'll be hearing more in San Diego from us anyway, Father Joe's Villages. I would suspect that other services providers will also similarly be out there in the public trying to engage people.
I mean, there's so many examples of how churches have offered their space. I mean, recently it's a lot of churches offering a parking lot for people who are sleeping in their cars or RVs. I know I did some research up in Seattle, and there was a whole coalition of churches providing space for tent camps. All of this is, it's temporary. It's not a fix. And so I would agree with Deacon Jim that we really, what churches can do is provide a moral voice and speaking out. I know in my community, I'm in a fairly rich county with pockets of marginalized communities, and there's a huge NIMBY movement. Every time the state has mandates for affordable housing, the towns in my county find reasons that they can't do the affordable housing quotas. And it's never couched in racial language, but it's really about race. And so we do have, I'm forgetting the name of our group, but we have an ecumenical religious group in our county that speaks out at these county meetings and provides a moral voice that it needs to be yes in God's backyard, that we all are humans of equal worth and dignity. And housing is a basic human right that people need to do everything else in life, and especially for children to develop and for elderly people who might have more health issues as they get older. So there's lots of things individual churches can do, but I think really being a presence and organizing with other religious organizations across different religions and with secular organizations to be a moral voice and keep pushing for better policies that create flourishing communities. That's utterly important.
Thank you. And we are just 5 minutes short of time. So I do want to encourage those to go into the link that Dr. DeConnick used to ask questions for our panelists. But just as a fleeting thought from myself, I'm going to take the stage. There's a new campaign of housing as a human right. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really important campaign because it goes against just providing shelter to those who have been seen as deserving, right? And I think especially with your commentary, you're saying that the church is providing a stage of which people can all be seen as human and seen with compassion. And yet the stigma of the title homeless is already a dehumanizing stigma. And so just very briefly, what does housing as a human right, what does that mean in terms of how the church might materialize that and take that into account as a campaign, if in an ideal world? And I think this is really hitting at what Dr. Stivers was going at, which is talking about the root cause of homelessness. And oftentimes it's a really hard question. So be as abstract or as imaginative, but what does that look like for the kind of work that you want to engage with the church and making the church count? Just ideas. Does that make sense?
Doctor, you go first.
Okay. When my students talk about housing as a human right, they want to say, oh, we're just going to give everybody housing. I don't think that's actually what we're talking about. For me, it's about the church being involved in revisioning how we are as a society, that homelessness is not just a thing that we take for granted that it exists, because there are nations that don't have a big homelessness problem. And so it's really about addressing the extreme inequality we have in our nation and seeing homelessness as a problem of poverty, that people are without a home because they can't afford to pay for one. Now, there might be some people that still slip through the cracks no matter what, because they might have, addictions or mental health, but then we should be having some support for that as well. So I know politically it's really hard to get these kind of things passed, but that's why the church is so important, because really we're called as disciples of Christ to be there for all people, not just those who might be saved, but for all the marginalized to be equal to everybody else and have a place to be housed.
I agree with that. Thank you. And we need to recognize, and I think it was said before, that it should be more than just a church. It should be more than just Christianity. I mentioned our partnership with the Judaic community, but it should be even more than that. I mean, the homelessness does not discriminate, right? It is not just Catholics who are homeless, not just Christians who are homeless. We have those who are Jewish, we have those who are Muslim, we have those who have no faith at all. I mean, it's just across the board, and it's across all ethnicities, it's across all age groups, right? And disabilities, veterans are impacted. I mean, and so it really does, what the church can do is be a voice, all right, in order to draw everyone into this effort, based on the fact that truly, I do believe, whether you have faith or you have no faith, fundamentally, I think we're built in such a way, when we see human suffering, I think we have a tendency of needing to do something about it. I think that's just built into us, right? And so again, I think that we need to encourage everyone in the community to realize that this is an issue across the board. The fact that we do so well, we are a capitalistic society, and that's great, right? And San Diego has become more and more beautiful since I moved in from New York City, by the way, Dr. Santiago, back in '97 when we moved here, and has developed, and it's incredible how well it's developed just in these last years that we've been here. And that's all well and good, right? But if, as a community, we have to recognize that, if nothing else, we'll be gauged by how we take care of the most vulnerable. I mean, I really do believe that. I mean, how can we be doing so well as a community and leave people on the streets? It reminds me again, for those of you who recall the scripture passage of Lazarus, right? That he was at the doorstep of someone who ate scrumptiously, right? Scrumptiously. And Lazarus just yearned to eat just the scraps from this person's table, right? And the table, and the person never paid him any mind. Didn't even give him the scraps, right? And so we don't want to be known as a society that, is a Lazarus in a sense. We have to really come together and recognize that, yes, we do well as a community, but really, as I've always said, as we at Father Joe's Villages help people off the streets, the community as a whole becomes healthier. And that's what has to be recognized.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Deacon Vargas and Dr. Stivers. I'm going to send this back to Dr. DeConnick to conclude. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to conclude also just with a word of thanks, both to our wonderful audience members, but also to our two panelists and to our moderator, Dr. Santiago. This has been really just an enlightening and eye-opening conversation for me personally to hear these different perspectives and ideas and models kind of at play in people's different ways of thinking about this issue. And I know the same is true for everyone who's been putting questions in the chat and so on and so forth. So thank you all so much.